everyone. Thank you for joining us for Social Equity Series part. I lost track a little bit. I think we're on six, though, or six or seven. So today we are going to hear from the wonderful Holly Simpson. And today's session is actually a little bit different. It's almost a collaboration situation between how our presentations have been and almost the chat and choose. We're hoping to have some dialogue. So we're just going to start off. Susie already put in the chat. If you have Slido questions, please put them there. I know that a lot of people join us and they are listening to the magic behind the scenes. So if you want to put things in the chat or use Slido, that would be great. Holly is going to present some things to us and ask us some great questions that we hope will produce some dialogue as we talk about equity versus equality, as that's a conversation that I've had a lot, but I don't think we've had on a larger space. And Holly was gracious enough to lead us in that space. So I'm going to turn it over to Holly. Holly, if you could just start off by introducing yourself and what you do, how long you've been at ODOT, what you like to read, I don't know, whatever you like to say, and then how you think about equity, and then you can jump right in.
All right, well, welcome everyone. Thank you for allowing me, Nikatris, to have this conversation today. I've been with ODOT since May of 2019, so not very long. And I work in OPO, the procurement office, as a contract specialist. And I became a social equity partner at Nikatris's invitation that went out to all of us a while back. And I actually became a social equity partner because I wanted to learn more about it. I wanted to get outside my comfort zone, my sphere of influence, and I wanted to learn more about this conversation, equity, diversity, inclusion, all of that, and not just go with what I thought it was, but see what people are talking about and join the conversation and see if I could add value to it as well. And in my free time, I do like to read and do puzzles and that kind of thing. So anyway, welcome and thank you again. This is a little bit out of my comfort zone doing this whole thing today. So just bear with me. And like Nikatris said, I hope that we're going to have some good conversation around this subject. I am by no means an expert on this. I'm learning along with everyone else. And so thank you again for allowing me to lead this conversation. So the first thing I wanted to talk about was the difference between equity and equality. We hear those buzzwords a lot, but do we really know what they mean? And so equity really is giving the same level of support to everyone, treating everyone the same, giving everyone access to the same opportunities. Equality is really equality is giving the same level of support to everyone and treating everyone the same, making everything equal. It's kind of like when you have your kids, you treat them all the same. You give them all the same food to eat at mealtime. Rules are the same. But equity is varying levels of support depending upon the need and giving what is needed to be successful. It's more proportional representation. And going back to the analogy of your kids, you have more than one kid, you know that you want to treat them all equal, but they don't all need the same thing. They don't all need the same level of support. They don't all like the same foods. Not that you're going to be a short order cook and cook, 5 different meals all the time. But I know growing up, I had four sisters, and my mom, the rules were basically the same, but I know that what was expected of me was not the same thing that was expected of some of my sisters in school. I was expected to do better and have higher grades than one of my other sisters because she had a learning disability. So that kind of can give an example of the difference between equality versus equity. So you want to treat them all the same, love them all the same, care for them all the same, but every person, whether it's in the same family or in society, everyone has a different need. Everyone has a different skill set. Everyone has a different level of opportunity at times, just based on socioeconomic things. And so in being a social equity partner, we had a conversation in one of our sessions, because we meet regularly. We had a conversation in one of our sessions about equity versus equality, and a picture speaks 1,000 words. And this one picture was brought up, and it just made it so clear to me. And Nakatris, do you have that available, or do I need to share my screen?
I can share. Give me 1 second.
Okay. And so there's a picture I wanted to share, because once I saw this, it was almost a light bulb moment for me. And it really shows, because a lot of the conversation around equity and equality I feel like in the most recent times, that it's been around certain people groups, but it really is about so many more people groups. It's about the disabled. It can be about your ethnicity. It can be your size, your weight. It can be whether you're an adult or a child. And so when you look at this picture, so you can see equality is giving everyone the same bicycle. Well, the same bicycle doesn't work for every person. And so when you look at equity, you're giving what is needed for success. And so you're giving the disabled person a bicycle that they can actually use. You're giving the child one that's fit for their size. You're giving, the female who is smaller in stature than the tall guy, you're giving them all what they need to succeed and be able to participate, not necessarily giving them all the same thing, because giving them all the same thing is not helpful. It's not usable. And so I just really thought that this picture explained so much of it. And I kind of want to take a minute right here, that after all of this conversation and dialogue, does it help you to see the difference? Does it help explain the difference between equality and equity? And do you have any questions around this, any comments? And how do you feel you can use this on a day-to-day basis to understand the difference between the two and engage in conversation with others about it as well? So Susie, I guess we'll just wait and see if there are any comments or questions at this point. And we really do want this to be interactive. I don't want to be the only one talking this whole time, and neither does Nakatris.
There are a couple of things in the chat. There isn't any in Slido.
So I just put the question that you just posed, Holly, after hearing the definition of equity and equality and seeing the picture. Does it help you understand the difference, and how can you use this?
Yes.
And in the chat, it was shared. I think one of the super important parts of equality is how it creates advantages for some. So I don't know if you want to talk about that or how you've experienced that, because equality creates advantages for some people, or more benefit for some people.
Well, it does. And so if you look at the bicycle picture, you can see that when you do equality, there's really only one person successfully comfortable riding a bicycle. And so I do think that she has the advantage because the bicycle fits her. It doesn't fit anybody else. So it does create an advantage there. And I think also, going back to the analogy of raising kids, if my mom had lowered
Holly,
yeah.
Your mic is cutting in and out a little bit.
Oh, it is? Well, I'll try and get closer to it. I have a new laptop and it's been somewhat problematic. So hopefully this will be better, but thank you for telling me. I think that it can be seen as privilege. I see a comment there that it can be referred to as privilege. We don't know that it's always privilege. I can see how it would be construed as privilege, because you would look at the woman riding the bicycle in the equality picture as being privileged, but actually, if she is privileged, it had nothing to do with her. Everyone was just given the same thing. And so it can be interpreted as privilege, but the intent was not to give her privilege over the other people. It was just giving everybody the same. I think that sometimes when we think of people having privilege, are they really privileged, or is it just that everybody got equal and they happen to be the one that benefited the most from and so
yeah, your mic is still going in and out. People can't really hear what you're saying. So I'm going to repeat some of it. So there was a question about, is it really privilege? And if it is privilege, it has nothing to do with the person who has the bike that fits them in the equality picture. And that being true, even if it is privilege, it's not privilege that they asked for. I think that's something that's really good to understand about privilege, because when we talk about privilege, especially when we talk about privilege around a social demographic, it's not that like, I didn't say like, I have privilege. I am, especially around ability. I'm able-bodied. I don't have any hidden different abilities. And so in that space, I have a lot of privilege in that space. And I didn't quote unquote ask for it. At the same time, when things are offered, it's never a burden. I never have to think about it in any different way. I don't need anything different. Like I don't need things to be translated. I don't need to be able to read them differently. I don't need colors to be a certain way. There can be stairs, the elevator can be broken. Like there's really nothing that's needed in terms of me being able-bodied, or me not having, have privilege around mental health. Like there's just a lot of privilege in that space, even though I didn't request it. And because of that, sometimes there are times where, people might feel a certain way, like, well, I didn't do anything to do it. And I still worked really hard to get where I am. And all that is still true. And I also am living with privilege. And so I think that sometimes it's hard to like think about the fact that we might have privilege in spaces, even though we haven't asked for it, because of how things are presented. So because of that, when people give me things to read, look at, or I need to get someplace, I'm usually okay. Like there's nothing else that I need. And so I think that it's helpful to talk about how it was thought about a privilege. Jessica said in the chat, this helps a lot. We probably need to ask people which bike works best for them rather than making assumptions. And Jennifer's +1 to Jessica, which is true. That's actually why we think about engagement as part of social equity, right? So we can ask people what they need. And let's see, equity includes equality. Everyone is getting a bike, but equality doesn't always include equity. True. Quality doesn't necessarily create an advantage. What if the bike didn't work for anyone is the question. So Holly, can you talk again to see if we can hear you? Because maybe if not, you can dial in.
Right, that's what I was asking. I didn't see a phone number listed on when you and I set this up. And so if there is a phone number I can dial in, I'm happy to do that. Otherwise, I can try and get out and come back in. Jennifer suggested that.
I'll get the dial-in information for you in just a second. I'll put it in the chat, Holly.
Thank you so much.
So they're gonna dial. Oh, that was you that asked that. Is there a phone number to dial in? So what if the bike doesn't work for any of them? I think that's still thinking about equity, right? Because it could be that you give everybody a bike and someone's like, I really need a skateboard for whatever reason. Like maybe sitting doesn't make sense. Just in a bike scenario, sitting doesn't make sense. I need to be able to stand while I get to a place, or I need to be able to do whatever. So it's very possible that a bike doesn't work for anyone, which is why asking people what they need is important. One big difference is that equality frequently focuses on measuring inputs. Everyone gets the same bike, where equity focuses on measuring outputs. We're providing access to transportation. Absolutely. And even in that, sometimes there's debate because there's thoughts of, should equity be providing opportunity, or is equity measured by opportunity, or is equity measuring outcome? And there's a debate around that, right? Because even in opportunity, it's not necessarily the input. It's like, what is happening to ensure that everybody can access something, what you're talking about? Or are we measuring that people are successful once they are able to get the access that they need? So there's actually, I think that there's two very differing opinions on that. And a lot of research that says it offers both of them. I think in how we're thinking about social equity at ODOT at this moment, we're also really thinking about how both of those are important. And so we'll measure them in both ways and look at it from as many ways as possible to make sure we're asking people what type of bike they need. Let's see. And you got the number, Holly? Working on it now. Also make sure you mute your computer mic when you dial in. Notice the person with the bike does not have, the person with disabilities doesn't have a bike per se. So I guess you're talking the hand bike, that the person that with in the equity picture, there's a hand bike instead of a bike that uses pedals in the same way.
Okay, can you hear me now?
Yes.
Oh, yay. Okay, success.
There's a comment that everybody needs a different size helmet. And there is a question from Slido. Do HR regulations in the public sector, union contracts, et cetera, present barriers to implementing equity? If not, barriers, at least complications? Absolutely, they do. A whole lot of them. I think that oftentimes in systems, period, systems, how they were created, because they were created so long ago, all of our systems, right? So United States, 1770s, like that's when systems were created and they've just been built upon. And so regulations are usually a rule or a regulation to answer something that we found a hole in or an issue in. And so there's a lot of barriers, which is why we're trying to figure out how to best, why social equity is even a thing. How do we identify those barriers and address them to minimize the complications as much as possible? When discussing ability, should we consider embracing the term alter-abled in lieu of disabled? So do you want to answer that, Holly, or do you want me to talk about it?
You know, honestly, I find personally, I don't know if we should. Certainly, if someone was going to be offended by using the term disabled and they wanted alter-abled, you know, I think you kind of can morph to what people are comfortable with, because we certainly don't want to be offending people. But at the same time, I think that in this space, that terms are changing so quickly, it's kind of hard for me anyway to keep up with what the politically correct and acceptable societal term is today. So I think we need to be comfortable talking with people in the terms that we understand and are familiar with, and then be sensitive that if someone is offended by a term that we use, we, as Nikatris tells us, we thank them for making us aware of that, and we can change moving forward from that point. And so I think it depends on your audience, and I think it depends on your level of knowledge too. Honestly, I've never heard the term alter-abled before. This is new to me. So Nikatris, do you have anything to add?
I would totally agree with you. And also say that, so yesterday, we did ADA at ODOT, and David Morrissey talked about language a little bit. So you can go back and watch that video. It should be uploaded today. It's towards the end of the presentation, talks about language, because there's a lot of different ways it's used in different contexts. Like it's still a handicap parking spot, even though we don't call people handicap anymore. There's also spaces where the thought about using people first language in any situation, right? So you're talking about a person who is living with a disability, or who is disabled, or who is alter-abled, or who is differently abled, hidden disabilities or hidden abilities versus invisible. And so what I do is I do my best to learn all the different language I can and use it interchangeably so that people always feel included and know that I'm talking about them as well, because some of it does have a lot to do with preference and how people identify. And that's not just with ability, that's with anything, right? Like when we think about, and I think another term that we're using right now that is embraced and also loathed is BIPOC. So it stands for Black, Indigenous, and People of Color, but there are people who don't feel like they're in that space, like they don't feel included. And so I've also seen BIPOC with a slash, AI and AN, which will be American Indigenous, or AIAN will be Alaskan Native, ANAI, Alaskan Native And I think it's American Indigenous. I've heard people say that I'm a sovereign tribe, or I'm from a sovereign nation or a tribal nation. So they would prefer that word to people of color. I know Black people who would not identify as Black and they identify as African American. And so they don't like the term for that as well. And so I try my best to use a term and then also make sure when I'm talking about it, I'm also including as many people as possible. So we're also talking about Asian Pacific Islander, and we're talking about people who might identify Hispanic or Latinx or Latin teen and don't want to leave anyone out. So I think language gets really tricky. And I try my best just to learn the offensive language, like the one that like really takes people aback and has been really clear about why it's offensive, and not use that, and use a multitude of terms that would make sure people know that I'm talking about them too and want to include them. There are so many messages in the chat. We all need to look at ways to be equitable. Many times folks that need something special feel embarrassed to speak up for themselves, but if they asked, they would opt for the modification. Absolutely. I love this conversation, learning so much about new ways of looking at it, specific to privilege. That's one of those words that has a meaning in the equity conversation lens, and a little different meaning sometimes for those who aren't looking at it through this lens. Like privilege as a thing, we get a reward for something, versus a thing we may not be aware of, and that we have that gives us advantages over others who don't have it. Bobby, I like that term. Also, I think people living with disabilities is preferred over disabled. This is a good definition of systemic. Nationwide and worldwide, I find that people have strong individual feelings while being offended by terms disabled versus wanting to use it and destigmatize it. What's also interesting, I'll say about disabled, so I identified as somebody who was ableist in like 2017. I just realized how many things I didn't know about people living with different abilities, and how often I didn't think about it and how I moved throughout the world. And so I enlisted a mentor who really helped me like figure some things out, and we exchanged like knowledge around a whole bunch of things. And they're a person who's living in a wheelchair, and they love the term disabled. They're like, I don't have the ability to do things, it's disabled. And like when people would play with language or move language, they would always go, oh my gosh, I'm just disabled. And it's an individual thing, but there is definitely people who don't believe it that way, and research and articles that feel that way as well. So it's a lot to kind of figure out sometimes, I think. It's more saying people with disabilities or person with a disability rather than calling someone disabled. So that's the people first language. Your answer was loved, Holly. And that's more consistent with the current ODOT writing style, to clarify Robin's comment, which is it's more saying people with people first language, which would be for any identity, a person who identifies as, or a person who says, so that we're all people and we have different identities. There are so many comments, Holly. This is your dialogue. Okay, here we go. Are there thoughts about the image above on the idea of liberation? Oh, but I can't see the image above. Okay, I'll get that, and then I'll change the images in 1 second. So here's the official question I'm gonna shoot to you, Holly. I think it's less about the specific term being offensive versus non-PC and more about how folks are treated. That is the offensive part. The question is, where does intent versus impact fit into the equity discussion, if at all? If that's something we need to consider in creating policies or transportation projects. In other words, trying to think about who might be unintentionally and negatively impacted by a policy decision. So I guess thoughts around impact, intent versus impact.
Mm-hmm. Well, and it's such a challenging thing, as you were saying, Nikatris, because it's like the person who is in a wheelchair and you said, yes, they identify as disabled. They're not offended by that at all. But then, other people are. I am not disabled. And so I do think it's something that we have to consider, absolutely. But again, the terms are changing so much. Everybody identifies and wants to be identified differently, that it really does create kind of a landmine situation where you don't want to offend someone, but how can you be all encompassing at the same time and include everyone and show respect? And I think maybe that's kind of the bottom line, is that you want everyone to feel valued, respected, and seen. And you want to acknowledge them and their situation in the way that they want to be acknowledged. But that can be such a challenge, because you can, our intent would be good in creating policies in transportation projects and just in a day-to-day conversation, whether it's at work or outside of work. Our intent hopefully is good, and that people will see that when they feel the impact. If our words are landing with impact, then impact, that's usually, like an accident, and not a positive thing. And so hopefully that when we're having those conversations and communications with impact, people will give us the benefit of the doubt with our intent. And even if they don't, and our words are, impacting them in a negative way, that we will create a safe space where they can talk about that and feel like they can share with us that did impact them negatively, and we can course correct. But I think in, a global thing, I know that the OTC has been working with ODOT on the strategic plan, and that they have a lot of information in there about social equity and these issues. And I think that it's going to be really challenging, to move forward. Nikatris, you can speak to this more than I can, but, just trying to keep up with all those terms so that people do feel included, like you were talking about. Some people want to be referred to as Black, some want to be African American. It's hard. I think it's a really difficult thing, and we do have to be sensitive to it. But again, hopefully people will see our intent, that our intent is not to impact them negatively or cause offense. And so I think it's kind of a balance between the two. Does that help?
Absolutely. Oh, I think so. I think it was great.
Okay.
So
Okay.
Kim asked, how do we use language to draw lines between us? And I think you kind of just answered that. And then also it was offered, like, if you ask people what term they're comfortable with, and then you use that term, we can move beyond the terms to address, so we can get to the problems. And then Patrick offered that I argue that person saying the wrong word is usually the person who, through their reaction to being called out, is like creating the drama. Folks should focus on being gracious when receiving feedback. And that's something we've talked about. That's why I say that, saying thank you. So I think about intent and impact, like you just talked about. I ask that people assume good intent. And I ask, like, if I'm talking to you, Holly, I ask that you please assume my good intent. And also I am accountable for the impact. So my intent doesn't excuse the impact. So if the impact is something that it's like, I don't like that, or this is why I don't feel welcome in this space, I am thankful that you told me that so that I can shift, because we agreed that my intent was good, but that doesn't make the impact irrelevant, right? And I have to be accountable for that. That's not on you.
Right.
So it's 11:30. I know you had another question you wanted to go through, but there's a picture too. I don't wonder if you want to go to the next part and then maybe a picture at the end.
Well, let's see. Is that what you prefer? I just don't want
you to lose time. If you want to shift, I think this will start another conversation. Do you want to shift to the other piece you were hoping to do?
I do, yeah. Can we show the Big Ten list, and then we can have some dialogue about it?
Yeah, absolutely.
So what we're going to talk about now is ODOT has come up with what they call the Big Ten. And what it is, it's a compilation of social identities that ODOT is using to focus on through the Office of Social Equity. And I saw this, Nikatris, didn't you present this at the Fall Forum, I believe? Is that where I first saw it?
Mm-hmm.
And I thought it was really good because there are so many people groups impacted by equity, equality, inclusion, diversity. And I think that it's really good to be exposed to who really is part of that group. And so do you have it up, Nikatris?
Give me one second.
Okay. And so some of you may have already seen this, but again, with the picture of the bicycle, I just think that looking at this and seeing all the things that are included, and it used to be known as the Big 8, but 2 more categories were added to this by ODOT. They added age and first language, just to make sure that everyone is included. And so I'll just start talking about it. The first one, let's see. Am I supposed to do something? I saw something pop up on my screen, Nikatris.
I don't think so.
Okay, all right. So the first one we want to talk about is ability, and we've been talking about that in talking about disabled, handicapped, that kind of thing. But ability also has to do with not just physical, but your mental capabilities and how you're socially engineered. And so that has to be taken into consideration. And then there's some of the obvious ones like nationality, race. But I think it's important to note that age is in there too. And I can see age being an issue, whether you're young or you're old, because I think sometimes older people can think, oh, younger people, they don't know anything, they're so inexperienced. And then younger people can think, well, older people who maybe have been in a position for a very long time, even at ODOT, well, you know, they're so stuck in their ways, they're old, they're outdated, they're not up with technology. And so I can see how there can be biases in age on both spectrums. And so race and ethnicity, I think those are pretty self-explanatory and things that are have been hot topics before. And religion, or maybe even a lack of religion, you know, and I think we need to be sensitive to that, but that's something that's been talked about quite a bit in the past as well. And then first language, I can really see that being an issue in today's society. You know, America has always been a melting pot, and I think that it would be a challenge that, you know, if I were to move to Russia and had to learn Russian and it wasn't my first language, that definitely would be a challenge for me and something to overcome. And of course, sexual orientation, gender, and not just whether you're male or female, but what you identify with and how you're looked at by how you identify. If you don't identify with the same way that, you know, you came into this world, that can be a challenge for you. And it can be a challenge as to how you might feel you're accepted by others in your sphere of influence and socialization. And then your socioeconomic class. And I just think it's so important to broaden our perspectives. This really spoke to me when Nikatris first shared it. And it's kind of why I wanted to be involved in this conversation today, is because these two pictures, the bicycle one and this Big 10, really helped me open my view of equity, equality, diversity, inclusion, that kind of thing. And I just felt for myself that it was really important to be able to join this conversation, to broaden my own understanding, as I've said before. And I think that coming to the table and being involved in society and being sensitive to these types of things, that we need to understand more about it. I think that there's a lot of misinformation. I think that there's fear. I think that there's maybe even some, I don't know what the right term would be, some rigidity and like, you know, I don't want to learn about this. Everyone just has to get along. Everyone has challenges, and everyone just needs to put on their big girl pants and move forward and do what they have to do. And so I just think that it's important, though, to be sensitive and gain understanding in the conversation and not take a hard line against it, because the whole point is to make sure that people feel valued, that people are appreciated, that people can reach their full potential. It's just like, you know, we've been talking about today in a family. When you have children, you want them all to excel. You want them all to soar and reach, you know, great heights of success and be happy in life and prosperous. And it's no different in society. We want that for ourselves. We want that for our children. We want that for each other. And it's not an easy thing. And I think too that it's important to examine ourselves and see what unconscious biases we may have just from the way we were raised. And, you know, we could even have an unconscious bias about this whole issue. I don't want to learn about equity and equality. I just want to move on like we've been going. Why do we have to talk about this? And I really think that the why is because everyone has value. Everyone needs love. Everyone needs acceptance. Everyone needs to feel safe. Everyone needs food and good housing. And the same that we want that for our family members, we should want that for everybody. And so that really, to me, that's my why. And so I'm just wondering if anybody has any questions around this and how can we come to the table and apply these things in our jobs at ODOT, with ODOT? How can we influence ODOT for the positive in this area? And then how can we do it personally in our own families, in our own households? Because even in our own families, we have people from all diverse backgrounds, of all ages, different religious and political views. You know, I saw a little cartoon about the Thanksgiving table, and it was funny. Given COVID and everything, it wouldn't apply, but it was an interesting caricature because it was assuming that people were going to be gathering with family and friends at Thanksgiving around the table, and they were talking about politics, and then at the end they decided, I just ate a whole lot of money on Christmas because I'm not buying as many Christmas presents as I once was going to, because the conversations didn't go very well politically around the Thanksgiving table. So it was a cute caricature. But at the same time, we need to include people in our own families with different opinions than we have. And so that's really the why and the bottom line for this whole conversation. Nikatris, what would you add to that?
So I just want to add something just about the Big Ten as a resource, but I want to point you to the chat, because there's some things in there that might be something that you would address or speak some more about.
Okay.
But yes, I wanted to add something about the Big Ten. Yesterday, I had a really good conversation with someone who was like, I don't understand, like I don't want to talk about these things. And I was just explaining that the Big Ten is a resource, which is why, and it's an internal resource, right? Like we talk about it in terms of it's internal. It's not something that is like, this is ODOT's official thing. Not that it can't be shared, but it's to help us think about what we're talking about when we think about social equity, and that we're talking about identities that from a lot of lenses are not necessarily optional. We either learn them very young, or they're inherent in who we are, or we experience it based on experience that is part of who we are when we're young. And so we grow up in that space, like socioeconomic class. I could have been raised poor and now middle class, but a lot of the ways I move and the way I interact with the world will in some ways always be from that lens in terms of how people might see me and the barriers that are connected to it. So the goal for this resource is not for people to go through and go like, I need to memorize all of these things and be able to talk about them, but more just to go, I understand the types of things we're talking about when we speak about social equity. Because when I first started some social equity, we talked about social equity, we're talking about finances and geography. And like, you know, I'm a vegetarian and you're a vegan. And so we just wanted to make sure that we had a frame that people were all kind of talking about the same things. And all of these things too, in terms of the identity, the systemic inequities are often based on assumption or mischaracterization of people with these identities or different identities in these spaces. It's not because everyone's a certain way. I really appreciated someone said that their mom is 70 years young and way more competent with technology. And so they call for help with their phone, which makes so much sense. And in a lot of spaces, people wouldn't walk up to a 70-year-old like, hey, can you help me with my phone? Or they're in line. Well, we don't get in line anymore. But at one point we were in line at like the, cell phone store, and you don't want to be in line behind the person who appears to be older because you're trying to get in and out, and you can just tell that their questions are going to be too much. And how can you just tell? Like, it's really just based on their age. So I just wanted to add that this was a resource that people don't have to memorize or like feel like they have to agree with all the definitions. It's a way for us to all be talking about the same things when we think about social equity and we start thinking about engagement and burdens and benefits. We're talking about burdens and benefits in terms of how people identify in these ways.
Mhm. And then, yeah, looking through more of these messages, Jennifer comments about the elephant in the room, relevant to aging. And yes, the retirees being hired back, yes, do impact those who are younger with fewer connections. Yeah, it is definitely a complex and multifaceted issue for sure. And I'm not sure I have much to add to that, Jennifer, but I do understand I receive your point. And Jessica, yes, absolutely. It is about people feeling valued and being able to give back and add value. I know that for me, that if I didn't feel I was adding value to my job, I couldn't stay. And everyone needs to be on both the giving and the receiving end of value. It's so important. And yes, Justin, it is a difference in personalities. And it is super important to promote this growth mindset, whether we're talking with family members or whether we're at work. I think it's just a universal thing that we need to be doing. And again, to Jill's point, we are all family. And I agree with that. Everyone is a distant cousin somewhere. And so I like that. Sorry, my mouse is not cooperating. Okay, and then let's see, Leanne. Yeah, wow, that's interesting. So it sounds like, Leanne, back to the ADA conversation earlier, organizing a training that allowed her to cross the street in a wheelchair, and just even knowing and I know that being in procurement, ODOT has done a lot of work around the ADA ramps, but I don't know that there's a perfect solution to any of this, but it is definitely something that we need to be sensitive to and be talking about. And then Nakatris Cam Region 5 was thanking you for recognizing the family and community backgrounds. And yes, I agree, Susie, it can be hard to understand disadvantages or areas of oppression. I think of that saying, and I think it was from the Indian tribal culture, walk a mile in someone else's shoes. And I think that that's something we can agree upon, that, you don't know what their life is like and what challenges they really do face. And I think it's important that we try to have compassion for other people, whether they're disabled or whether we think that they're completely privileged. I think it's important to have compassion for each other, because one thing I've realized is everybody has a story. And I used to be, when I was younger, an impatient driver. And I've just come to realize that, we were in the car the other day and my husband got cut off and he was frustrated by it. And I said, you don't know what that person is going through. They could have just come from dropping a loved one off at a hospital. They could have had a terrible morning and burned the toast, and the kids were fighting, and the dog went to the bathroom in the house, and who knows what people are going through. And I'm not saying it's an excuse for bad behavior or poor driving, but I think that we need to show more compassion in society to people and try to be more understanding and get into their space and what their day is like, what their circumstances are like. And just try, I think that doing that would bring so much understanding. And so now I'm reading Jennifer's, and yes, people are looking at their own financial and career situation. Need to acknowledge how it makes people feel, even if we have a good explanation for why we do it. Agreed. And I think that comes back to compassion and respect. I think respect is such a big thing. And, with all the political things that have gone on this past year, I just feel like, and this is me personally, that we've lost such respect for each other. It would be interesting to see if CNN and Fox News could ever get together and have a respectful conversation and agree on facts. That would be miraculous, in my opinion. And I just think that if we can't come together and we can't have compassion and want to gain understanding of each other, I'm not sure what will happen to our society. And I don't mean to digress, but I do think that we have to be compassionate and understand how people feel. What is their life like? And regardless of whether or not you agree with me or not, you are a human being and you have value, you breathe, you are worthy of love, and I want to listen to you and I want to try to understand. And I think we have to try to get to that space as human beings to cohabitate. And Nicole, that's nice. It's nice to know that the retiree you're working with is really helpful and quick. And Jennifer also loves working with retirees. Oh no, I wasn't thinking, I'm sorry if I gave the impression that you were anti-retiree. I didn't get that from that. But yes, budget and position definitely impacts what's done there.
Do you mind if I just read a few so that if somebody can't see
No.
the chat, they know what we're talking about a little bit?
Please, Nicolás, thank you.
Yeah, Holly's been talking about compassion and we've been mentioning retirees. There was just a comment made about one way to think about just an elephant in the room as a state agency and relevant to aging is that we hire retirees back as contractors, and it doesn't impact the FTE budget. And it also could be taking opportunities or reduce growth or income for existing employees, especially those who are younger with fewer connections in an agency. But it's also mentioned that in doing that, there's probably a lot of training people have gotten from working with retirees that come back because their experience is that such, they were here, and retirees come back as temps and are sharing their knowledge with those coming behind them. And also, well, this is also good to know that all these things can be true at the same time, right? Like equity doesn't mean there's not a whole bunch of truth we're trying to figure out. So yep, that's true. And also it's limiting, in practical application, it does limit some things for individuals who are currently here, and individual is looking at their own financial and career situation. So how do we acknowledge how it makes people feel, even though we have intention and a good explanation for why we bring people in? And it was mentioned. And also, as someone who's very new to ODOT, working with an retiree has been extremely helpful. And then just a reminder that none of this was anti-retiree. It was just understanding how there's a budget impact, there's a position impact, and there's an impact on the lives of retirees, and there's an impact of current employees or people who would like to work at ODOT who are not retirees at the time. So just bringing all those into one conversation and thinking about age and how it can show up in terms of equity. Do you want to do any of the following comments? Some of the other comments are just, so there's a comment, I wish people understood what that, someone else has a differing opinion, politics, for example, because Alex just brought that up. It doesn't make the other person wrong. It just makes them a person with a different opinion.
Right. Well, and I think Jake's comment is very interesting about intent versus impact. And I totally understand what you're saying with that. But I do think it still matters because, and I think too, yes, the impact is huge. If someone gets hit by a bus, that is huge. But your intention is important. And I think it would be important even in a court of law if you thought about it that way, that if you ended up running into someone who got hit by a bus, I'm not even sure that would be involuntary manslaughter versus murder or something like that. In the end result, yes, somebody got really hurt, it maybe passed away. But I do think your intent matters when doing anything, because your intention was not to hurt or to cause harm. You were trying to keep yourself safe. And yes, it still had a negative outcome, but I think it's much different when you look at it from that perspective than someone who is committing a crime and somebody dies in the process of that crime. So I totally understand your point, and it's not that I disagree because the impact is the same. but I do think your intent matters. I think everybody's intent matters. And someone told me a long time ago, and I thought it was so true, that we really need to think the best about people. And it was in relation to parents, and someone had had a really difficult upbringing, and the comment was made that sometimes people are just doing the best they know how to do at the time. And I'm not excusing this wasn't a situation of child abuse or anything like that. It was just the parents were difficult growing up. And sometimes I think that we need to believe the best about people, and it's not always true. The intentions are not always good or pure. But I think that, for the most part, we at least need to figure that out and try to determine, was the intent to harm, or was the intent maybe ignorance, misinformation, or maybe we misinterpreted what they were saying. And I think it just comes back to respect. And I think that if we could start believing the best about people and respecting each other more, that this would be equity and equality would be a much easier conversation. And so let's see. Then let's see, our culture tends to try to find a single point of focus. The conversations, no, they aren't easy to boil down. That's for sure. But I know we need to close up here pretty soon, but I wanted to mention too that I just think a really good starting place to wrap this up that is to listen to people. And we can only control ourselves, and even that can be a challenge at times. And if we can, each one of us, start listening, creating safe spaces for people to share, having compassion, being sensitive to others, and showing respect, then I think that's a really good place to start. I mean, I think there's 55 participants in this group alone. And so if each one of us is able to have a positive takeaway from this, and we can change our dialogue or the way we see people, or even just open our minds to being compassionate and trying to understand where that other person is coming from, what the challenges that person may face are, and wanting to know, I think that I think there's a lot of hope for society. I'm just reading, there's some more comments here. Nikatris, do you have anything to add while I read through these?
No, I don't think so. I think that it is great to continue to have conversations, and we will, of course. We still have more this month. We have one every week. We have one next week, the week after, and our last one is December 28th. We'll have our last one for the year, and then we'll do social equity series because it's actually, I think, worked a little bit. We'll do it once a month into the next year. And have even some people who will come in from outside of the agency to talk to us again in an internal space where it'll just be posted on the intranet. But it is very exciting. I think that the quote that, two quotes that stood out to me just now is do unto others 20% better than you would expect them to do unto you, to correct for subjective error. Linus Pauling said that, and that makes a lot of sense to me. And then one of the favorite things I tell my friends, my family all the time is to, be gracious with each other and with yourself, because we're gonna make mistakes. We're gonna say something that people don't like, and how do you show grace to yourself, and how do you show grace to each other to ensure that we can continue to grow? And Andy said, especially right now, and I would say especially past right now too, right? I think that sometimes we get caught in moments where we are realizing that things are rough for everybody, and then when things start to get better for what looks like the majority because of TV or because of our circles, we forget that some people are still struggling the same way that we were whenever. So to always remember to be gracious with yourself and others. And now I'm going to add 20% to my do better. You have anything you would like to say before we close?
I don't think I do, other than, I'm learning about all this too, and I just appreciate all of you joining in today. And thank you, Nikatris, for the opportunity to be a participant in this. I appreciate it. And thank you all for your time.
Thanks, everyone. Have a beautiful rest of your week, and hopefully you'll join us next week. Bye.
All right. Bye-bye.